History is good at keeping certain things. It keeps the names of battles, it keeps the words of important people, it keeps the dates of treaties and the numbers of the dead. What history is not so good at keeping is the feeling of daily life, the small, repeated, quietly unremarkable acts by which ordinary people held their lives together across 6 years of the Second World War. The morning routines, the evening habits, the things people did every day without thinking, and the things they did every day thinking of nothing else. During the war, life often felt measured not in victories or losses, but in the slow, steady rhythm of small habits. While the world tracked battles and strategies, families across towns, villages and cities kept their own quiet calendars. This is a record of those invisible moments, the daily life that left no official trace, yet held entire communities together. It is a record of human resilience expressed not in grand gestures, but in the quietly mundane. Here you will find the gentle heartbeat of ordinary people, moving through their days with patience, ingenuity and care. Every small habit, every quiet adaptation carries a story of survival, of maintaining dignity, of preserving the feeling of home when everything around it felt uncertain. Get comfortable now as we move gently into these unknown stories from all around the world. Fact number 1. Almost every account of wartime civilian life touches on something that no official record ever found a proper category for: the quality of the very first waking moment of a wartime morning. Those few seconds between consciousness arriving and the memory of circumstances quietly returning. People who kept diaries during the war years came back to this moment again and again, with a consistency that suggests it was among the most universally recognized experiences of the whole period. It was a brief, clean interval, a few seconds before the mind had fully engaged, in which the world still felt normal. And then, gently but inevitably, everything that wasn't normal came back. The people who recorded this for the Mass Observation Project described it with a precision that only lived experience could provide, the feeling of reaching toward an ordinary day, only to find it quietly revealing itself as something different. Some people learned, over months and years, to perform a kind of mental steadying before full consciousness arrived, a soft, preemptive preparation for the day's reality that made the transition from sleep a little gentler. Others simply allowed themselves those few seconds of not knowing as the one reliable luxury the day offered. It was a routine that no commanding officer ever issued orders about, that no government communication ever addressed, and that nevertheless shaped the emotional starting point of every single wartime morning for millions of people across the entire length of the war. Fact number 2. The morning fire, the business of laying it, lighting it, and coaxing it slowly into life, was a daily wartime routine so fundamental to British domestic life that its eventual disappearance in later decades has made it almost impossible to explain to anyone who did not grow up with it. Coal was rationed, which meant that the fire had to be managed with a care that peacetime had never required. The ashes from the previous night were sifted carefully for any usable cinders. The new coal was measured out with a quiet awareness of how much remained and how far into the week it still needed to reach. The kindling was arranged with an efficiency that wasted nothing. The women who managed the household fuel supply, and it was almost always women, developed a deep practical knowledge of fire economy that was entirely invisible, entirely real, and never once acknowledged as a skill by anyone outside the kitchen. A fire that went out before the water had heated was a small domestic disaster with consequences that ran through the whole morning. No hot water for washing, no heat for the porridge, no tea. The morning fire was not simply background to the day, it was the condition of the day. And the woman who managed it successfully had performed, before 7 in the morning, an act of quiet material competence that kept the household functioning, and that nobody then or since ever thought to record. Fact number 3. The queue existed before the war, but the wartime queue was an entirely different institution. It was a daily social structure with its own etiquette, its own emotional rhythms, and its own particular kind of community built among the people who stood in it, sometimes for hours, simply to secure the basic necessities of a household. Queuing in wartime Britain was not a passive act. It required early morning intelligence work. Who had heard that the butcher had something in, which fishmonger was expecting a delivery, whether the line at the grocer's was worth joining before it reached the corner. The women who managed their family's food supply learned to read the signs of availability the way a general might read a battlefield. A cluster of women gathering near a shop door before it opened, the absence of the usual queue outside a bakery, the particular speed with which a fishmonger's assistant was wrapping parcels. None of this intelligence was written down or formally shared. It existed entirely in the minds and habits of the women who gathered and used it, and it was as organizationally sophisticated as anything the military was doing at the same time. It was conducted with fewer resources, under greater constraint, and without any of the institutional recognition that military logistics routinely attracted. It was simply done, every morning, and then quietly forgotten. Fact number 4. The wartime practice of mending, the careful, skilled, unglamorous work of repairing worn clothing, darning socks, reinforcing collar edges, unpicking old garments and remaking them into something new, was elevated by clothing rationing from a household chore into something closer to a daily occupation. The government's Make Do and Mend campaign gave the practice a public name and a set of printed instructions, but it did not create the practice. It simply formalized something that women had always done and that now needed to be done with greater frequency, greater skill, and greater ingenuity than peacetime had ever required. The evening mending basket, brought out after the dinner things were cleared, positioned near the best available light, worked through with a concentration that was both purposeful and quietly meditative, was a nightly ritual for millions of households across the country. The skills it required were passed between women with a casual thoroughness that no formal education could have replicated. The proper tension for a darning stitch, the best method for replacing a worn collar, the technique for taking in a dress when the person wearing it had lost weight. None of this existed in any official record. It lived in hands, and in the knowledge passed from mother to daughter across kitchen tables in the evenings, while the wireless played and the fire burned low and the house settled into the particular quiet of a wartime night. Fact number 5. The daily management of the ration book, the careful arithmetic of coupons and allowances that governed every trip to every shop for every household in Britain from 1940 onward, was a routine of such sustained and detailed attention that the women who performed it were in effect running small domestic accounts offices. A typical week's ration for one adult in 1942 consisted of 1 egg, 2 ounces each of tea and butter, an ounce of cheese, 8 ounces of sugar, 4 ounces of bacon and 4 ounces of margarine. Allowances so small that their careful management was the difference between a household that made it through the week and one that ran short. The ration book itself had to be physically presented at registered shops, which meant that even changing where you shopped involved forms and offices and administrative process. Women managing households for several people, children, elderly parents, lodgers, tracked multiple ration books simultaneously, planning menus against the week's available resources the way a military quartermaster might allocate supplies against available stock. This was accounting work of genuine complexity, performed entirely without formal training, without recognition, and without a single mention in the historical archive of wartime economic management. It was done every day, quietly and competently, and then it was done again the next day. Fact number 6. Soldiers in training camps and garrison postings developed morning boot polishing routines that were, in their own quiet way, as elaborate and as privately meaningful as anything happening in civilian kitchens at the same hour. The British Army's requirement for boots polished to a mirror shine, the ritual known simply as bull, was not merely a vanity exercise or a discipline measure, though it was honestly both of those things. It was also a daily meditation, a 20-minute practice of focused attention that asked nothing of the mind except that it be present to the task and allow the hands to do their work. Veterans who wrote about their military daily routines returned to boot polishing with a specificity suggesting it had meant more to them than it superficially appeared. The small tin of polish, the worn-down brush, the circular motion of a dampened cloth on a surface that gradually began to respond. There was something in this routine that was both entirely absorbing and entirely mindless, a combination that the anxious wartime mind seems to have found genuinely restorative. The boots came up. The day began. Whatever the day was going to be, the boots were ready for it, and the 15 minutes spent making them ready had been, in their quiet way, a preparation for considerably more than just the kit inspection that followed. Fact number 7. The daily task of fetching water, not from a tap in the kitchen but from a communal standpipe, a neighbor's functioning supply, or a mobile water cart, was a wartime routine that returned to millions of urban people an experience their grandparents would have recognized as ordinary, but which they had understood to belong to the past. Bombing damaged water mains throughout British cities during the Blitz and beyond, creating supply failures in affected areas that could last days or weeks. The routine that resulted was an improvised domestic practice of complete practicality. The morning expedition with whatever containers were available, the careful rationing of the collected water through the day's washing, cooking and drinking, the constant low-level awareness of how much remained and how much the rest of the day required. Children who carried water cans in these circumstances were performing labor that their pre-war lives had never asked of them and that their post-war lives would never ask of them again. The skill of managing a household on severely limited water, knowing which tasks could be done cold, which required heating, which could be deferred entirely, was acquired through daily necessity, used every day, and then forgotten the moment the supply was restored, as completely and as finally as though it had never been learned at all. Fact number 8. Among the most universal and least formally recorded of all wartime daily routines was the act of listening to the wireless. This was not the passive, half-attentive consumption of broadcast entertainment that it might look like from the outside. It was an active, physically attentive ritual that shaped the day's emotional tone in a way that no other single daily act quite matched. The morning news bulletin, the midday summary, the evening broadcast, these punctuated the wartime day with an urgency their peacetime equivalents had never possessed, because the news was not merely interesting, it was directly relevant to whether people one loved were still alive. The quality of listening in a wartime household was different from any peacetime version of the same act. People sat closer to the set, they turned the volume lower so that every word was clearly audible. They became noticeably still in a way that visitors to wartime homes sometimes found quietly unsettling. The wireless became simultaneously a clock, a calendar, and an emotional regulator. The day organized itself around its broadcasts in a way that was routine but never quite mechanical, because what might be said on any given day could change everything. The habit of falling silent when the announcer's voice shifted in tone, the particular held breath quality of wartime news. These daily practices shaped millions of people's relationship with information and with each other in ways that no policy document describes. Fact number 9. The daily inspection of a vegetable garden, the Victory Garden or Dig for Victory plot that millions of British and American households established in response to government encouragement, was a morning routine that combined domestic practicality with something less easily named. The garden visit was partly an inventory, checking what was ready, what needed attention, what the weather or pests had done overnight, what might be ready for tomorrow's meal. But it was also, for many of the people who performed it, something else entirely. A few minutes of contact with growth and soil and the ordinary, unhurried processes of nature that the wartime world had otherwise largely suspended. People who wrote about their wartime gardens returned to this daily visit not as a practical act but as an emotional one. The specific pleasure of finding that the runner beans had grown another inch overnight, the small satisfaction of pulling a weed that had been threatening a row of carrots, the quiet comfort of a plot that was responding to one's care in ways that were visible, tangible, and entirely outside the logic of the war. The garden was a daily reminder that something was still growing, still following its own laws, still indifferent to whatever was happening on the other side of the fence. Nobody recorded this as a form of civilian resilience. But that is precisely what it was, practiced every morning across millions of plots by people who had no particular language for what the garden gave them beyond the vegetables themselves. Fact number 10. The wartime habit of saving everything, the ends of soap bars pressed together into a single composite block, the last inch of toothpaste coaxed from a flattened tube, the cooking fat collected in a tin on the stove, produced a daily micro-routine of salvage and economy that reshaped people's relationship with material objects in ways that persisted long after the conditions that had created them were gone. Before the war, the end of a bar of soap was thrown away. During the war, it was pressed firmly into the next bar while both were still damp, a technique requiring knowledge of exactly the right moment in the drying process to achieve reliable adhesion. Toothpaste tubes were rolled from the bottom up with a precision that would have seemed excessive in peacetime. Fat was separated from pan drippings with a care that treated every tablespoon as a genuine resource rather than a byproduct. These microeconomies of material life were practiced every day, automatically by people who had learned them as practical necessities and who continued them afterward as habits whose origins they sometimes forgot. No official record describes the specific daily practice of pressing soap bars together, but the people who did it remember it with a clarity suggesting it was more than merely thrifty. It was a daily assertion that nothing available for use would be wasted, and that the distance between enough and not enough was a distance you could manage with your hands. Fact number 11. The wartime morning walk to work. performed on foot by millions of civilians whose previous commutes had relied on public transport that was now disrupted, overcrowded, or requisitioned for military use, created a daily routine of physical engagement with the urban environment that pre-war habits had never required. People who had previously traveled to work by bus or tram found themselves walking 2, 3, or 4 miles each morning through the same streets they had previously seen only at window height from a moving vehicle. The walk changed what they knew about the city they lived in. They began to notice the particular houses on particular streets, the patterns of light and weather at different points along the route, the rhythm of other regular walkers whose paths crossed their own at the same corners at the same times each morning. These observations were never formally recorded. They were simply the quiet accumulation of an altered daily routine. But they built, over months and years, an intimate knowledge of local geography that was different in character from anything a vehicle window had ever offered. The wartime pedestrian knew the cracks in the pavement, and the smell of a particular bakery, and the exact angle at which the October morning light fell on the church tower at the top of the road. This was knowledge without purpose beyond itself, accumulated without intention, and lost without record when the commute eventually returned to its former mode. Fact number 12. Among the most intimate and least discussed of all wartime daily routines was the specific practice, performed in thousands of households every single morning, of checking whether a letter had arrived, the trip to the front door, the examination of the mat, the particular quality of feeling that each possible outcome produced. Households with family members in military service waited for letters the way they breathed, continuously, with a background anxiety that was always present but managed just sufficiently to allow ordinary daily functioning. A letter's arrival was not simply good news, it was evidence of continued existence, a physical confirmation that the person who had written it had been alive at the moment of writing and had been in circumstances calm enough to allow them to sit down and compose words. The absence of a letter was not news, it was the continuation of uncertainty, which was its own specific condition requiring its own daily management. People who managed this uncertainty across years of wartime service developed a practiced capacity to register the morning's outcome, adjust the day's emotional starting point accordingly, and continue. This was never acknowledged as a skill. But for the people who had acquired it, it represented one of the more quietly demanding internal achievements of the entire wartime period. Fact number 13. Factory workers who began the war performing skilled manual labor in their own trades, and who were progressively redirected by the demands of wartime production into entirely different kinds of work, developed daily routines of occupational adjustment that have no name and no record. A cabinet maker redeployed to shell casing production performed his new task every day while retaining, somewhere in his hands and his body, the muscle memory of the work he had trained for and would not perform again until the war was over. The morning walk to the factory involved a preparation that was part practical and part internal, a specific settling of the mind into the work that was coming, as distinct from the work one's training had fitted one for. Veterans of wartime factory redeployment described this as a daily renegotiation with their own professional identity, not a crisis, and not quite a grievance. A quiet daily adjustment to the reality that the skills one had spent years acquiring were for the duration less important than the capacity to perform a different task reliably and without complaint. This adjustment was made every morning, silently, by millions of workers across every industry the war had reorganized, and it represents a form of occupational flexibility and psychological adaptability that the historical record of wartime industrial production almost entirely ignores in favor of the output statistics the adjustments made possible. Fact number 14. The daily practice of writing, the letter home, the diary entry, the note to a neighbor, was a wartime routine that connected private emotional experience to the historical record in a way that is not always recognized for what it was. People who wrote letters during the war were not in general thinking of themselves as historians. They were doing what people do when they are separated from those they love and the world has become uncertain enough to make the act of communication feel urgent. They were reaching across the distance in the only way available. The specific daily routine of letter writing, finding the time, finding the paper, sharpening the pencil, deciding what could be said and what personal caution made unsayable, was a more complex act than it appears. It required the writer to translate the texture of daily experience into words that would make sense to a reader in entirely different circumstances, to find what was worth saying among everything that was happening, and to pitch the emotional register at a level that was honest without being alarming. This calibration was performed every day by people with no training in either writing or emotional management. The results, preserved in archives from Massachusetts to Manchester, are the closest thing to a record of wartime daily routine that history possesses. Fact number 15. The daily management of children's anxiety, performed by every parent and every teacher and every adult who spent time with children during the war, was an unrecorded labor of emotional regulation that constituted one of the most demanding and least acknowledged of all wartime daily routines. Children asked questions that adults did not know how to answer. Where was father? Would the bombs come tonight? What happened to people whose houses were hit? Why was the world like this? The daily routine of answering these questions, or of managing the silence around them, of creating an atmosphere of sufficient normality that the child's day could proceed without the paralysis of uncontrollable fear, required an adult to maintain, in the presence of the child, a level of calm that frequently bore no relationship to their actual emotional state. This discipline was practiced every morning, at every breakfast table where a child sat with questions in their eyes, and a parent worked to provide the specific quality of unhurried, confident attention that children need to feel safe. It was never recognized as a skill. It generated no official documentation. It was simply done, day after day, by parents who were themselves frightened and exhausted, and maintaining, through a daily act of quiet will, the appearance of a world that was still, fundamentally all right. Fact number 16. The specific daily routine of tuning an illegal wireless set, performed in occupied countries across Europe by civilians who risked imprisonment or death to hear the BBC's foreign language broadcasts, was one of the most charged of all wartime daily acts, and one of the least recorded precisely because the people who performed it had every reason to leave no trace. In France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark and Norway, listening to the BBC was prohibited by the occupying authorities, and the sets on which people listened had to be carefully concealed. Wrapped in cloth, hidden behind false walls, tucked into coal cellars, brought out each evening with a care that was simultaneously practical and ceremonial. The routine of extracting the set, positioning the aerial, tuning carefully to the correct frequency, and then listening with one ear while remaining alert to any exterior sound that might require rapid concealment. This was a nightly practice that millions of people in occupied Europe performed for years. The specific physical habits involved, the particular way a set was wrapped, the pencil mark on the dial's back, the agreed signal between household members that meant "hide it now," were never written down. They were forgotten by those who survived, rendered unnecessary by liberation, and replaced by the perfectly ordinary right to listen to whatever one pleased. Fact number 17. The wartime habit of economizing on hot water, imposed by fuel rationing, by the government's 5-inch bath recommendation, and by the practical reality that heating water required coal that had to be managed with extreme care, produced a daily hygiene routine that was entirely practical, entirely unglamorous, and so thoroughly erased by the post-war return of plentiful hot water that it became difficult for the people who had practiced it to explain to those who had not. The official recommendation that baths contain no more than 5 inches of water was supplemented by informal household economies, sharing bath water among family members, reducing the frequency of full bathing while maintaining daily partial washing of face, hands and feet, using the cooling water from a tea kettle to supplement the inadequate hot supply. The specific daily routine of what was washed and in what order, of which tasks required hot water and which could be managed cold, of how to achieve an adequate standard of cleanliness under real constraint. This was practical knowledge that wartime imposed and post-war prosperity made obsolete. The people who practiced it daily for years knew exactly what it cost them in comfort and convenience, and they managed it without complaint, in the quiet knowledge that there were people elsewhere managing with considerably less. Fact number 18. In the occupied territories, the daily practice of maintaining a face of normality in front of German soldiers, of continuing to walk to the market, to greet neighbors, to go about the ordinary business of a life that was not ordinary, was a form of daily performance that required a sustained act of psychological self-management. Civilians in occupied France, the Netherlands and elsewhere described the specific challenge of this daily routine. The walk past a German checkpoint required not merely the physical presentation of identification papers, but the maintenance of a facial expression and bodily bearing that communicated neither hostility nor excessive agreeableness, neither fear nor the obvious absence of it. The people who performed this every day, on the way to the shop, on the way to work, on the way back home, developed a specific daily discipline of emotional concealment that was practiced so regularly it became for some a second nature. The daily performance of being not dangerous, not suspicious, not worth looking at twice, was an act of survival. It left its practitioners, after years of practice, with a relationship to their own emotional expressiveness that liberation did not immediately restore. The composure had been worn too long. It had left a quiet mark. Fact number 19. The wartime school day, altered by evacuation, by reduced classroom space due to requisitioning, by the shift to part-time teaching imposed by buildings shared between displaced schools, and by the constant disruptions of air raid drills and alerts, was experienced by children as a daily encounter with institutional unpredictability that peacetime schooling had not prepared them for. Teachers who maintained classroom routines under these conditions were doing something easier to describe than to do. They were creating an experience of normality and purposefulness within circumstances that were neither normal nor purposeful in any obvious sense. The daily rhythm of lessons, playtime, dinner, the school register, the morning hymn, the assembly, these were maintained not because they corresponded to the world outside the classroom but because they provided, inside it, a counterworld of structure and continuity that children genuinely needed. Teachers who did this well were performing an act of quiet institutional theatre, sustaining the convention of ordinary education within the reality of extraordinary circumstances, in buildings that might have been damaged the previous night, in front of children whose homes might have been hit, with the specific professional grace of people who had decided that the children's claim on normality was more important than their own honest response to the situation. Fact number 20. The daily preparation of wartime meals. The constrained, imaginative culinary labor performed by household cooks working with rationed ingredients, scarce alternatives, and the constant practical challenge of feeding people adequately on resources that pre-war cooking had never required such careful management of, was a form of daily creative work that left almost no record. The recipes published in wartime government pamphlets and women's magazines were attempts to systematize a culinary improvisation already being performed daily in kitchens across the country. Mock cream made from margarine and milk, carrot cake using carrots for sweetness in the absence of sugar, potato pastry stretching a small quantity of fat over a larger surface, but the specific daily decisions made by individual cooks, the substitution of one thing for another when the prescribed ingredient was unavailable, the adjustment of timing and temperature to account for variations in fuel supply, the judgment call about which meal could be reduced and which needed to be maintained at its full allowance to keep a working person or a growing child adequately fueled, these were recorded nowhere. They were made, used and forgotten, day after day, in the practiced knowledge of people who had learned their kitchens the way pianists learn their instruments, through daily contact with specific materials, developing over time a fluency that was invisible from the outside and irreplaceable from within. Fact number 21. The daily work of maintaining morale in a household where fear was a constant presence but could not be named directly was a form of emotional labor performed predominantly by women, and performed so quietly and so continuously that neither the people who did it nor the people who benefited from it typically recognized it as work at all. It was not the dramatic, public morale building of government posters and BBC broadcasts. It was the keeping ordinary of breakfast, the effort to set the table properly, to serve the food attractively, to speak in a tone of voice that said everything is manageable, in a household that knew things were not, in any objective sense, entirely manageable. It was the decision made every morning before the children came downstairs, what face the day would have, and what register the household would operate in. Women who performed this work for years described it, in interviews and memoirs, with words that reveal its real cost. The internal effort of presenting calm when calm was not what they felt, the daily maintenance of a domestic emotional atmosphere that sheltered the people inside it from the full weight of what was happening outside. It was labor without recognition because it was successful when invisible, when the household simply felt all right, without anyone asking how it had been made to feel that way, or who had done the work of making it so. Fact number 22. The specific daily habit of checking the Anderson shelter, the corrugated steel structure half buried in back gardens across Britain, was a routine that combined the practical with the quietly anxious in a way that perfectly captured the character of civilian wartime daily life. The shelter needed to be checked each morning for overnight water accumulation, which was a chronic problem in the damp British climate and required regular bailing to keep the floor usable. Bedding stored inside needed periodic airing to prevent the mildew that the shelter's underground conditions encouraged. The door needed to be checked for ease of opening, because a shelter door that stuck during an air raid alert was worse than no shelter at all. Children were sometimes sent to perform this morning shelter check as one of their wartime household duties, a chore that gave them a daily physical engagement with the war's reality in a form that was manageable and purposeful rather than frightening. The specific smell of the Anderson shelter, damp earth, metal, the particular mustiness of enclosed underground space, became, for those who had one, among the most indelibly sensory memories of the wartime period, recalled decades later with the involuntary clarity of a smell that bypasses conscious memory and arrives directly as lived experience. Fact number 23. Soldiers in garrison and training environments developed a morning routine of kit inspection preparation that was performed with a precision and private ritual quality that no military manual captured and no commanding officer supervised. The inspection itself was supervised. The sergeant walked the line, checked the boots, examined the blanket fold, looked at the rifle's cleanliness, but the preparation for it, performed in the hour before full military consciousness settled over the barracks, was a private routine conducted in the particular half-lit atmosphere of a room not yet fully awake. Men developed their own techniques, accumulated over weeks and months, for achieving the required standard with the minimum of wasted effort, the specific cloth for the specific surface, the sequence of tasks that allowed one thing to dry while another was worked on, the quiet mutual assistance between bunkmates who had established informal arrangements for covering each other's weaknesses. These individual techniques were the subject of constant informal exchange, the kind of practical knowledge sharing that happened below the level of formal instruction and that constituted, in the aggregate, the real curriculum of basic military life. The official manuals told a soldier what standard was required. The unofficial morning routine, assembled gradually from personal experiment and peer advice, told him how to meet it with what he had and in the time available. Fact number 24. The wartime habit of talking to absent people, the daily mental conversation conducted with a husband at sea, a son in North Africa, a father in a prisoner of war camp, was a daily routine so universal and so private that it left almost no trace except in the diaries of people honest enough to record it. It was not prayer, though it sometimes resembled prayer. It was not fantasy, though it required imagination. It was the specific practice of maintaining a relationship through the daily discipline of imagined address, of continuing to speak, internally, to someone who could not hear, as a way of keeping the connection real until it could be resumed. Women who had done this throughout the war described it in retrospect as something they had barely noticed doing at the time, as natural and as automatic as breathing, and as something they had not stopped doing after the person returned because the habit had become so deeply embedded in the daily routine that its absence felt stranger than its presence. It was one of the ways in which ordinary people managed the specific form of loss that wartime imposed. Not the clean loss of death, which at least had a form, but the suspended loss of someone who existed and was unreachable, whose continued existence had to be maintained daily by an act of quiet mental will. Fact number 25. The daily work of a village postmistress during the war years was a routine of such specific and sustained emotional complexity that it deserves far more historical attention than it has ever received. The postmistress was the person who handed out the telegrams, the official War Office communications reporting casualties, and the daily possibility of having to do this to a neighbor, a friend's mother, a woman whose children she had watched grow up, shaped the entire texture of her working day with an anticipatory dread that no formal aspect of the job description ever acknowledged. The moment of recognizing a War Office envelope in the morning's mail delivery was a daily encounter with the possibility of the worst news, before knowing whose name was on the envelope. The management of that moment, the brief period between recognizing the envelope and reading the address, was a private daily practice that postmistresses rarely discussed and that no occupational history of the period records. The women who performed this job for the full duration of the war, who handed out the telegrams, watched the faces of the people who received them, and continued to function as the postal service through every day of it, had a wartime experience shaped by this specific daily possibility in ways that their own subsequent silence about it suggests they found difficult to describe and preferred, quietly, not to revisit. Fact number 26. The daily morning shave that military regulations required of soldiers across all forces was, depending on the conditions of the moment, either a routine 3-minute camp task or an act of genuine physical difficulty performed with inadequate water, inadequate light, and inadequate time. The military's insistence on the clean-shaven face as a standard of professional appearance, maintained even in field conditions where every other aspect of personal comfort had been stripped away, was from the command's perspective a discipline measure and a unit cohesion ritual. From the soldier's perspective, it was simply one of the things that had to happen before the day could officially begin, performed in whatever water was available, with a razor that might or might not have been sharpened recently, in a mirror that might be a small square of reflective metal balanced on a pack rather than anything one would ordinarily call a mirror. The specific daily negotiation of this requirement, the assessment of what water was available, the decision about whether heating it was feasible, the rapid execution of the shave with whatever passed for adequate equipment, was a daily exercise in military pragmatism that connected the soldier's immediate physical reality to the institutional requirements of the army in which he served. Nobody recorded the specific improvisations. Nobody archived the technique, but the morning shave happened every day, and the man who completed it was in the army's understanding of things presentable and therefore ready. Fact number 27. The daily practice of reading a newspaper, the specific wartime habit of opening it with a set of particular expectations and a practiced method of navigating its contents, had changed its character entirely from the pre-war version of the same act. The wartime newspaper reader had learned to read between official lines, to interpret what was not said as much as what was, to recognize the specific syntax of communiques that described defeats in the language of strategic withdrawals and losses in the language of orderly consolidations. This interpretive skill was acquired gradually, through daily practice, and represented a form of media literacy that had no pre-war equivalent and no straightforward post-war continuation. People who had read newspapers throughout the war described afterward the specific quality of attention they had brought to the daily paper, a combination of hunger for information and practiced skepticism about the form in which it arrived. The daily newspaper reading of wartime was not merely an act of information consumption. It was an act of active, practiced decoding, performed at kitchen tables every morning by millions of people who had never taken a course in media criticism but had been taught its essential skills by 6 years of daily practice. They had become, without ever being told they were, a generation of careful, watchful readers. Fact number 28. The specific daily routine of a wartime nurse, the particular sequence and quality of attention that the morning ward round required, was shaped not only by the clinical demands of patient care but by the specific emotional conditions of caring for people whose injuries were the direct product of combat. The ward round in a military hospital was not merely a medical inspection. It was an emotional circuit, a daily traversal of a landscape of human damage that required the nurse to see clearly, to assess accurately, and to maintain in her manner a steadiness that communicated competence and calm to patients for whom those qualities were as therapeutically important as the dressings being changed. The discipline required to enter a ward each morning, with full knowledge of what the beds contained and what the day's work would involve, and to perform that work without either the detachment that would make it mechanical or the emotional immersion that would make it unsustainable, was a form of professional daily practice that wartime had intensified far beyond anything that training had prepared for. Veterans of wartime nursing, interviewed in the 1970s and 1980s, described the morning ward round with a precision suggesting it had been the day's defining moment, the point at which the full weight of the work was confronted fresh, again without the buffer of yesterday's familiarity, and the decision to continue was made once more. Fact number 29. Children in households where a parent was absent on military service developed daily routines of performing small tasks that had previously belonged to the absent parent, tasks whose execution was simultaneously a practical contribution to the household and an unconscious way of maintaining the connection to the missing person. A boy who had always helped his father carry the coal now carried it alone. A girl who had held the wool while her mother wound it now held it for a grandmother or a neighbor. The specific tasks varied by household, but the pattern was consistent enough to appear across the oral histories and diaries of wartime childhood that have been collected. The child who steps into the practical space left by an absence and performs the tasks associated with that space as a daily act that is partly useful and partly, without being articulated as such, a form of waiting. These daily labor substitutions were not recorded as significant either at the time or afterward, because they were understood as practical contributions to the household's functioning rather than as the emotionally complex acts they also were. The child performing the absent father's tasks was doing two things simultaneously, helping with the housework and keeping the father present through the daily repetition of his habits, and the second of these was as real and as consequential as the first, even though only the first was ever visible. Fact number 30. The nightly routine of checking the gas masks, a requirement that the government's civil defense communications emphasized with sufficient consistency to create genuine household anxiety about compliance, was a daily practice that combined the management of equipment with the management of an underlying fear that the equipment's very necessity represented. Gas masks in Britain were issued to every civilian and required to be kept in working condition and accessible at all times. The nightly check, confirming the mask was in its case, the case was where it could be reached quickly in the dark, and the rubber had not degraded, was a physical routine that engaged the mind briefly and specifically with the possibility that enemy gas attack might require its use. A possibility real enough to justify the regulation, and remote enough to be, in daily practice, a background anxiety rather than an immediate fear. Children's gas masks were produced in versions designed to be less frightening, some in Mickey Mouse styling, but the daily checking of these was, for parents, the same quiet act of confronting the war's reality in manageable form that the adult version represented. The gas attack the masks were designed for never came to Britain, but the nightly habit of ensuring the mask was ready was performed millions of times by millions of households, a daily preparation for a contingency that never materialized, and whose non-materialization was itself never recorded as an absence worth noting. Fact number 31. The daily maintenance of a vegetable allotment by workers who tended their plots before or after full working shifts, arriving at the allotment site in the early morning before a factory shift began, or in the fading light of an evening before the blackout required them indoors, represents one of the most physically demanding of all wartime daily routines, and one of the least formally acknowledged. The Dig for Victory campaign created millions of new vegetable growers from people who had never gardened before, and the daily work of establishing and maintaining a productive plot required physical labor, practical knowledge, and a sustained commitment of time that competed directly with every other demand the wartime period made on those same people. The allotment site became in many communities a specific kind of daily social space, a place where men and women too tired for organized recreation could work in companionable proximity, exchanging seeds, advice, and the particular conversation of people engaged in the same physical task. These daily encounters at the allotment are not in any official record, but they appear in the oral histories and diaries of people who worked plots throughout the war as some of the most positively valued experiences of the entire period. Productive, companionable, physical, and in direct contact with something growing, in a world that had otherwise made those qualities genuinely difficult to find. Fact number 32. Among German civilians, the daily routine of the Eintopfsonntag, the one-pot Sunday meal that the Nazi government promoted as a national practice of collective frugality, encouraging families to eat a simple stew rather than a full Sunday dinner and to donate the savings to the state, was a weekly intrusion of political ideology into the most private of domestic routines. The practice was enforced not by legal penalties, but by the specific social pressure of a state that had made the performance of collective sacrifice into a public duty. Official collectors would visit homes to receive the money saved, which meant the decision of whether to participate was never entirely private. The daily and weekly food routines of German civilian life were shaped throughout the war by these intersections of state prescription and domestic practice, creating a domestic economy in which the choice of what to eat carried political dimensions that pre-war cooking had never possessed. The women who managed German households under these conditions navigated a daily culinary practice that was simultaneously constrained by worsening shortages and observed by a state that treated food choices as expressions of political loyalty. The daily morning assessment of what was available, what was needed, and what the day's meals would be was, in this context, an act with implications that extend well beyond anything that the ordinary practical management of a kitchen normally requires. Fact number 33. The wartime routine of the district nurse, the woman who cycled her daily circuit of house calls, managing the medical needs of communities whose access to doctors' surgeries had been reduced by the requisitioning of medical staff for military service, was a daily practice of mobile, improvised, autonomous healthcare delivery that has received almost no historical attention. District nurses in wartime Britain covered territories that had expanded as colleagues left for military service, managing conditions ranging from obstetric care to wound management to the social health assessment of isolated and vulnerable people whose wartime circumstances had cut them off from their normal support networks. The daily cycle route, planned each morning against the current patient list, adjusted for new calls received, managed against the available light and the condition of roads that might have been damaged overnight, was a professional routine of genuine complexity. It required clinical judgment, logistical planning, and the specific interpersonal skill of arriving at each household with sufficient focus and warmth to perform one's function effectively, regardless of what the previous visit had been or what the next one required. These women cycled thousands of miles during the war years, performed healthcare in conditions ranging from comfortable to desperate, and went entirely unrecorded because what they did was ordinary, the ordinary, daily continuation of a service that existed before the war and would exist after it, temporarily stretched and improvised to cover what the war had required. Fact number 34. The specific daily habit, developed by millions of wartime civilians, of mentally rehearsing what to do in a given emergency, where the shelter was, how long it took to reach, what needed to be grabbed on the way, who in the household might need physical assistance, was a form of daily mental preparation that existed below the threshold of conscious anxiety, but above the threshold of unconscious habit. People who had lived through bombing raids and who knew from direct experience the difference between preparedness and unpreparedness in the moment of an alert developed this mental rehearsal as an automatic daily practice. A brief, almost subcortical run-through of the emergency plan, performed at some point in the daily routine with sufficient regularity to keep the plan immediately accessible without requiring the person to think about it explicitly. This practice was not formally recommended in any civil defense guidance which focused on physical preparation, the shelter, the supplies, the gas masks, rather than the psychological preparation that experience had shown was equally important. It was simply the natural response of people who had been surprised once by the reality of an alert and had decided not to be surprised in the same way again. A daily mental routine that left no trace except in the reflexes it built, which were themselves invisible until the precise moment they were needed. Fact number 35. The daily task of washing clothing in wartime conditions, without the commercial laundry services many households had previously used, without adequate hot water, and with soap that was rationed and therefore managed with extreme care, was a physical labor of considerable intensity that fell primarily on women and that reshaped the weekly domestic routine around a task that pre-war domestic management had treated as a background service. Wash day in wartime Britain meant heating water on the stove, working clothing through a wash tub by hand or with a pozzer, wringing by hand or through a mangle if one was available, and hanging the results to dry in whatever space could be found, which in cold or wet weather might be the interior of the house, adding to the ambient moisture that the wartime domestic environment already contained in abundance. The specific physical demands of this work, the sustained upper body effort of hand-washing heavy items like work clothes and bedding, the reddened and roughened skin that resulted from extended contact with washing water and soap, were experienced by every wartime household that managed its own laundry, which by the end of the war was the great majority. The women who did this work had not been trained for it, had not expected it to become a regular feature of their domestic lives, and performed it through the full duration with the same unpublicized competence that they brought to every other dimension of the wartime domestic economy. Fact number 36. The daily practice of managing the ration book's social implications, the specific negotiation required when a household needed to redirect an allowance, combine resources with a neighbor, or manage the social embarrassment of being seen to have more or less than someone else, was a dimension of wartime domestic life that the official system had not designed for and that no record captures. Rationing was, in principle, equitable. The same allowances for everyone, administered through a universal system of registered shops and book-based allocation. In practice, the equity of the system was complicated by the social geography of its administration. A household with good relationships with its registered butcher sometimes found the available cuts distributed differently from a household whose relationships were more formal. A woman willing to stand at the end of the queue and accept whatever remained sometimes received more than the system strictly allocated, because the shopkeeper was managing a constrained supply against the competing claims of a queue of known customers with known circumstances. These daily negotiations, the specific conversation at the shop counter, the exchange between neighbors about how the week's supply might best be shared, the decision about whether to mention to the woman next door that the fishmonger had something, were the lived reality of the rationing system's operation, invisible to the official record and present only in the memories of those who performed them every day for years. Fact number 37. The daily spiritual practice of wartime civilians. The private prayer, the rosary worked through in a coat pocket on the morning walk to work, the habitual visit to a church not for a service but simply for a few minutes of stillness in a space that felt different from the street, was a routine that expanded during the war years among populations that had not previously considered themselves particularly religious. Studies of civilian religious practice conducted during and after the war consistently found elevated levels of private religious observance that did not correspond to increased church attendance in the formal sense. People prayed, or something that functioned like prayer, a daily directed interior speech towards something beyond themselves that the circumstances of the war had made it more urgent to address. The specific daily timing of this practice varied. For some people it was the first thing in the morning, a private orientation before the day began. For others it was the last thing at night, a relinquishment of the day's anxiety before sleep. For others still it was the involuntary prayer of an emergency, the instant, instinctive address to whatever might be listening that the sound of an aircraft or the distant thump of an explosion could produce in a person who had not prayed since childhood. This daily private practice left no record and attracted no official notice, but it was real, and it was daily, and it was one of the ways the war reached into people's interior lives and quietly rearranged things that had previously felt settled. Fact number 38. The WWII child's daily morning routine, the navigation of someone else's household, someone else's breakfast, someone else's expectations of how mornings should be conducted, was a form of daily cultural translation that required a specific adaptability from children who had in many cases never traveled further from home than the nearest town. The host family's routines were not the evacuees' routines. The food was different, the mealtimes were different, the social expectations around the table were different, and the child who had arrived from a London terrace into a Shropshire farmhouse was negotiating, every morning, a domestic world that operated on different principles from the one they had grown up in. Some evacuees adapted quickly and found the different household liberating. Others found the daily foreignness of the host family's routine a sustained and low-level misery that no one around them fully recognized as such, because the food was adequate and the roof was sound and the bombing was far away, and by any official measure things were better than they had been. The specific daily experience of waking in someone else's house and performing the morning routine according to someone else's rules was not recorded in any official evacuation assessment which measured success in terms of placement stability and physical welfare. The interior experience of the child at the unfamiliar breakfast table, managing the daily strangeness of a borrowed life, was simply assumed to be an acceptable cost of safety. Fact number 39. The wartime habit of listening for aircraft, the specific, daily attuned attention to the sound of engines in the sky that civilians in bombed areas developed and maintained as a background acoustic practice, was a routine of environmental monitoring that became so habitual as to be largely unconscious, except when it suddenly and completely became conscious. People who had lived through bombing raids developed an automatic categorization of aircraft sounds. The specific note of a Spitfire's Merlin engine, recognizably different from the slightly offbeat throb of a German bomber's unsynchronized engines. The distant quality of high-altitude aircraft compared to the close, immediate quality of something flying lower. This acoustic knowledge was acquired without formal instruction through repeated daily exposure to the relevant sounds, and was retained with a specificity that veterans described decades later with a clarity suggesting the sounds had been catalogued at a level of the nervous system not easily overwritten by time. The daily practice of listening, performed automatically alongside whatever other activity the day required, was one of the more complete integrations of wartime vigilance into ordinary life that the civilian experience produced, a state of background alertness that was neither exhausting nor fully relaxed, maintained through years of practice until it became simply the normal condition of being alive in a world where the sky was sometimes a source of danger. Fact number 40. The daily routine of the munitions factory worker. The specific sequence of actions performed at a workbench or machine for 8 or 12 hours, repeated with the precision that both safety and quality required, was a form of daily labor whose character was shaped by a combination of physical monotony, psychological intensity, and a specific relationship to the product being made that the workers themselves rarely articulated, but that their wartime diaries and subsequent oral histories reveal, was continuously present. The shells, the bomb casings, the aircraft components passing through their hands were not abstract industrial output, they were objects whose purpose the workers understood exactly. And the daily repetition of their manufacture was conducted with an awareness of that purpose that gave the monotony of the work a weight that ordinary peacetime factory production had never possessed. Whether this awareness was a burden or a motivation varied by the person and by the day. Many workers described it as both simultaneously, depending on the news and on their own circumstances. The daily morning walk into the factory, through the gate, past the guard, to the locker, and then to the workstation, was a daily crossing of a threshold into an environment whose demands were known, whose purpose was clear, and whose relationship to the larger world outside was more direct and more consequent than any peacetime employment had ever been. Fact number 41. The practice of keeping a wartime diary, in itself a daily routine, involved a specific daily negotiation between honesty and self-protection that shaped what these documents recorded and what they quietly withheld. The decision about what to write was partly conscious. The diarist chose what to include based on what seemed worth recording, what was safe to record, and what they were willing to put into the form of words that writing requires. But it was also partly governed by daily emotional state. The entry written in the aftermath of particularly bad news had a different character from the entry written on an ordinary day, and the accumulation of these varied entries produced a document that was neither entirely honest nor entirely guarded, but somewhere between the two, in the specific territory that the act of private writing occupies. Mass observation diarists were asked simply to write about their daily lives, and the range of what they chose to record reflects the range of what wartime daily life actually contained. The practical details of food and transport and work alongside the interior weather of worry, boredom, grief, and the occasional, unexpected eruption of ordinary pleasure that the wartime world, despite everything, continued to make available. These daily diary entries are the closest thing to a record of wartime daily routine that history possesses, and they are imperfect, partial, shaped by their writers' choices and silences, and therefore as human as the lives they were attempting to record. Fact number 42. The daily management of a child's fear. The specific, daily work of a parent who had to respond to a child's direct question about whether daddy was going to be killed, was a routine conversation that took different forms in different households but that had a consistent underlying structure. The adult managing their own response while simultaneously managing the child's, calibrating honesty against protection, acknowledging the reality of danger without allowing it to become the child's daily emotional residence. Parents who had to have this conversation regularly developed a set of personal scripts, forms of words that were neither dishonest nor devastating, that acknowledged what was real while preserving the child's capacity to function, that opened the conversation enough to release the child's anxiety without opening it so far that neither of them could close it again. These scripts were developed privately, from personal necessity, without any official guidance, and were practiced and refined through daily use until they fit the child and the circumstance. The specific words that a particular parent found, over weeks and months of daily use, to be the right ones for their particular child in their particular circumstances were never written down, never shared with anyone outside the immediate household, and disappeared with the end of the conversations that had required them. Fact number 43. The daily work of the wartime teacher in a reception area. The person responsible for managing a classroom of evacuated children from cities who had arrived in the countryside with their own habits, their own accents, their own social expectations, and their own homesickness, was a daily practice of cultural mediation and individual pastoral attention that no teacher training program had prepared anyone for. A classroom in a rural reception area in 1940 might contain children from wealthy London families billeted with working-class village households, children from slum backgrounds billeted with middle-class families who had never encountered extreme urban poverty, and local children whose own lives had been minimally disrupted but who were now sharing their school, their resources, and their teacher's attention with strangers. Every morning the teacher arrived at this situation and managed it, adjusting teaching materials, mediating social tensions, maintaining educational continuity for children whose emotional disruption made learning genuinely difficult, doing all of this in buildings that were often poorly equipped before the war and had not improved since. The teacher's daily improvisation was remarkable, and it was performed by tens of thousands of women, almost all teachers in those years, the men having been called up, and it left no record beyond the occasional school log entry noting an absence or a difficulty, and the adult memories of children who have now themselves almost entirely passed from the world. Fact number 44. The specific wartime bedtime routine, the nightly preparation for sleep that incorporated not only the ordinary personal hygiene and household security checks of peacetime, but the specific wartime additions of confirmed shelter access, confirmed gas mask location, and a brief assessment of the current raid risk that shaped decisions about whether to undress fully or to sleep in day clothes within reach of shelter-ready items, was a daily ritual that encoded in its specific components the entire civilian experience of wartime risk management. The woman who decided each night whether the current risk level justified sleeping in her clothes was performing a daily risk assessment based on accumulated experiential knowledge, the pattern of recent raids, the state of the current news, the quality of the night's weather, which affected bomber navigation, that no official guidance had provided but that months of direct experience had built into quiet instinct. The result was a nightly domestic routine that was simultaneously the most ordinary thing in the world, getting ready for bed, and a daily practice of risk calibration that bore no resemblance to anything that peacetime bedtime had ever required. People who had lived through the Blitz period, asked years later what they remembered most clearly about it, often reached for this nightly routine, the specific quality of the preparations for sleep in a world where sleep was not entirely safe, as their most honest answer to a question that invited more dramatic responses. Fact number 45. The daily practice of what might be called wartime thrift thinking, the continuous, automatic background monitoring of available resources and their potential alternative uses that the conditions of scarcity imposed on everyone managing a household, was a mode of cognitive engagement with the material world that peacetime comfort had not required and that wartime necessity had installed as a permanent feature of daily consciousness. The woman who noticed, while washing a garment, that a worn area in the elbow could be strengthened by a patch cut from another worn garment whose other areas were still serviceable, was performing a daily audit of material possibility that ranged from conscious to automatic depending on how completely the habit had been established. The specific items that attracted this assessment varied by household: clothing, kitchen equipment, fuel, food packaging, but the underlying cognitive practice was the same in every home, a daily scan of the available material world for the gap between its current use and its possible use, conducted automatically, without deliberate effort, as one of many parallel activities that wartime domestic management ran simultaneously. The post-war generation found this mode of attention difficult to explain to their children who had grown up in circumstances of relative plenty and for whom the assumption that a worn object had reached the end of its useful life was so natural as to require no examination. For the wartime generation, that assumption had been suspended for years, replaced by a daily habitual interrogation of every object's further possibilities. Fact number 46. The daily experience of a worker on night shift in an aircraft factory. The specific quality of arriving for work in the dark, spending 8 hours in artificially lit, noise-filled conditions, and leaving for home in either darkness or the early dawn, was a routine whose relationship to the natural rhythms of light and time was so thoroughly disrupted that the workers who maintained it for months and years developed a relationship with the day-night cycle entirely constructed around the artificial requirements of the production schedule, rather than any external environmental cue. The specific physical experience of this inversion, the body's persistent insistence through the middle of the working night that sleep was the appropriate response to the current hour, managed through strong tea, through movement, through conversation with colleagues, through the particular discipline of people who had learned to override their own physiology in service of a production schedule, was a daily practice of physiological management that occupied a significant portion of the cognitive and physical resources of a substantial fraction of the wartime industrial workforce. The long-term health consequences of this sustained circadian disruption were not understood at the time and were not acknowledged in the compensation or recognition that wartime industrial workers received after the war. The work was done, the planes were built, and the cost to the workers' bodies was treated as a private matter rather than a public one. Fact number 47. The habit of saving newspaper, setting aside the daily paper rather than discarding it, accumulating a stack that could be submitted to paper salvage drives, used to line shelves or drawers, pressed into service as insulation or padding, or provided to the Anderson shelter as bedding material, was a daily domestic routine that transformed the newspaper from an ephemeral consumption object into a resource with multiple potential futures. The specific daily decision about which portions of the paper could be used for immediate domestic purposes and which should be preserved for salvage collection was part of the same daily material economy that governed soap bars and cooking fat, applied to a material that had previously been considered entirely disposable. Children were often deputized to manage the household's paper salvage contribution, taking the accumulated stack to the collection point, noting with pride the weight contributed, connecting their daily domestic routine to the larger national salvage effort in a way that gave the household task a significance beyond its immediate utility. This daily engagement with the material life of the household, the constant assessment of what was usable, what was salvageable, what could be given a second function, was part of a larger shift in the relationship between people and objects that the war imposed, and that subsequent decades of abundance were required to gradually, incompletely undo. Fact number 48. The daily work of preparing an adequate meal for a family under conditions of rationing, shortages, and the specific culinary constraints of wartime required a form of creative problem-solving that operated within such narrow parameters that it constitutes, in retrospect, a remarkable demonstration of practical ingenuity. The cook who substituted oatmeal for breadcrumbs in a recipe, who used dried egg powder in a dish that normally required fresh eggs, who created a sauce from stock and dried herbs where the recipe called for cream. These were not exotic culinary experiments but daily domestic solutions to the routine problem of producing something nourishing and palatable from what was available. The specific daily knowledge required, which substitutions worked, and which produced results that family members would refuse, how to balance the limited supply of flavorful ingredients against the larger bulk of bland ones, how to use the cooking fat allocation to produce the maximum sensory effect for the minimum consumption, was practical knowledge of considerable sophistication, developed through daily experimentation and refined through daily feedback in the form of what the family ate and what it left. This knowledge existed in practitioners' hands and memories rather than in any formal record, and it was lost, largely when the conditions that had produced it were replaced by the post-war return of the foods and quantities that made its specific skills unnecessary. Fact number 49. The daily routine of soldiers in field conditions between operations, the morning stand-to at first light, which required every man to be in position at his weapon looking outward for the period during which a dawn attack was most likely, followed by the stand-down that released the watch but not the alertness, was a daily practice that originated in military tradition and was maintained through daily repetition until it became as automatic as any civilian morning routine. The specific quality of the stand-to, the cold of first light, the particular sounds of the landscape waking around a position, the slow clarification of shapes that had been invisible in the pre-dawn dark, the collective held breath quality of a group of men all doing the same thing in the same direction at the same time, was one of the most consistently described experiences in the oral histories and letters of soldiers who served in static positions. It was described not as dramatic but as precise, a daily encounter with a particular kind of attention, maintained across weeks and months of daily practice until it had become a reliable feature of the soldier's relationship with the world. The stand-to ended, the stand-down came, the morning routine of cooking and cleaning and maintenance began. But the stand-to's specific quality of alert, patient, outward attention, practiced daily until it was second nature, was carried back into civilian life by the men who had performed it, and was not something that the ordinary demands of a peacetime morning could quite replace. Fact number 50. The daily domestic routine of listening to footsteps in the street, the specific civilian practice, developed in occupied Europe and in blitzed British cities alike, of assessing from the sound of approaching footsteps whether they belonged to someone familiar or to someone whose arrival required a change in what one was doing, was an acoustic monitoring habit that the wartime conditions had installed in populations who had never previously had reason to develop it. In occupied countries, the distinction between a neighbor's footsteps and a German patrol's was a daily survival skill. In British cities during the Blitz, the sound of a warden's footsteps had a specific meaning relative to the more irregular footsteps of someone else. People who had lived with this daily acoustic monitoring for years described afterward a heightened sensitivity to footstep sounds that persisted for years beyond the end of the conditions that had made the skill necessary, a residual alertness that operated even in circumstances where it no longer served any purpose. A ghost of wartime attentiveness, haunting the peacetime body of a person who had learned to listen to the world with more care than ordinary life required. Fact number 51. There was a quality of unspoken performance that ran through almost every wartime morning, though no official document ever thought to capture it. Women who had lain awake cataloguing the sounds of the night, a distant engine, a neighbor's gate, footsteps whose tempo they could not quite identify, would rise, dress, set their faces into something calm, and walk into the kitchen as if none of that listening had happened. The performance was not dishonest, it was rather the chosen grammar of wartime domesticity, a shared agreement between family members that the household's emotional temperature would be set each morning by whoever was first downstairs. Sociologist Richard Titmuss, examining wartime welfare records in the late 1940s, noted with some surprise that the most common phrase appearing in women's morale reports was not a description of fear or exhaustion but a variation of "I just got on with it," words so uniform they read less like individual testimonies and more like a collectively rehearsed line. The daily composure was a genuine psychological labor, drawing on reserves that were never officially counted, never formally rationed, and never once listed on any government ledger. It was in every meaningful sense a routine that never made records, yet it held the fabric of millions of households together across 6 years of war. Fact number 52. Every afternoon, at some point between the end of the lunch hour and the dimming of the light, soldiers across every theater of the Second World War engaged in a habit that their commanding officers noticed, tolerated, and occasionally discouraged in vain: the slow, methodical cleaning of a personal item that had no immediate tactical need of cleaning. A mess tin scoured well beyond functional necessity, a knife blade wiped and re-wiped against a trouser leg, a belt buckle buffed with a thumb until it reflected a miniature distorted portrait of the man holding it. Paul Fussell, writing in Wartime, observed that soldiers developed a relationship with their personal kit that went far beyond utilitarian maintenance, describing it as a form of private negotiation with the material world at a time when everything else, including orders, geography, and survival, was entirely out of their control. The polishing was the one task that had a definite end, a visible result, and no enemy able to interrupt it. Veterans recalled the rhythm of it decades later with a vividness entirely disproportionate to the action itself, suggesting that the memory was preserved not because the cleaning was significant but because the brief, complete satisfaction it provided was rare enough to become precious. No officer ever thought to report it. No historian thought to ask. It exists only in the texture of memoirs, half a sentence at a time. Fact number 53. The midday meal in occupied France presented civilians with a daily problem so small, so specific, and so completely ignored by official history that it barely surfaces even in the best scholarly accounts of the period. Under German occupation, a significant portion of France's food supply was redirected to the Reich, leaving urban households to manage on rations that shrank steadily between 1940 and 1944. The average adult Parisian was officially allocated around 1,200 calories per day by 1942, roughly half the minimum required for light physical labor. Yet the black market, the informal barter economy, and the extraordinary creativity of French domestic cooking meant that millions of people fed their families adequately without ever appearing, to a casual observer, to be in crisis. Women learned to build meals around ersatz ingredients: acorn coffee, chicory, turnip stews stretched with herbs, bread cut with bran. The cooking itself remained elaborate in presentation, because to abandon the standards of French domestic cuisine was felt, by many women, as a form of defeat more intimate than any military surrender. This daily act of dignified improvisation, the careful arrangement of an inadequate meal onto a proper plate, the wiping of the table before sitting down, was witnessed by millions and recorded by almost none. Fact number 54. One of the least examined daily habits of the wartime home front was the particular ritual that took place at the end of the working week, when family members gathered around whatever remained of the household's available resources to undertake what people at the time simply called stock-taking, though few used that word, and no official record described the practice. It was in essence a quiet domestic audit. How much tea was left in the tin, whether the sugar was holding, whether the bacon ration had been wisely used or squandered on a moment of generosity midweek. In Britain, where rationing operated through a network of individual ration books tied to specific shops, this stock-taking carried real financial and nutritional consequences. A household that had miscalculated its weekly butter allocation faced the last days of the week without it, a hardship modest in absolute terms but loaded with symbolic weight in a culture that measured domestic competence partly through the reliability of the table. Mass observation diarists recorded this weekly audit with a frequency suggesting it was nearly universal, yet because it was private, unwitnessed by anyone outside the family, and left no paper trail beyond the ration book itself, it has never appeared in any official account of wartime civilian life. Fact number 55. Among soldiers stationed for extended periods in one location, a rear base, a training camp, a hospital recovery unit, an informal territorial system emerged around sleeping spaces that was universally observed but never written into any regulation. A man's bunk was understood to be not merely the physical space of a mattress and 2 feet of floor on either side, but a zone of personal sovereignty that the unwritten code of the barracks held to be inviolable. To sit on another man's bunk without invitation was an offense serious enough to cause real friction. To touch the personal photographs arranged on his shelf above it was an almost unforgivable intrusion. Veterans recalled these spatial customs vividly, often with greater emotional precision than they recalled any formal military regulation. The anthropologist Samuel Stouffer, whose team produced the landmark post-war study The American Soldier, noted that men's attachment to their immediate physical space increased in direct proportion to the degree of external chaos surrounding them. The bunk, the shelf, the small zone around it, these were the only portions of wartime reality over which a soldier exercised complete and uncontested authority, and the daily maintenance of that space, the careful replacement of objects after inspection, became as much a psychological anchor as any formal routine the army provided. Fact number 56. The problem of the unwashed cup is, on its face, a trivially domestic detail from a world at war, and yet it appears with striking regularity in civilian diaries of the 1940s, in mass observation reports, and in the recollections of women who maintained households alone for years while their husbands served abroad. The difficulty was not hygiene. Hot water was scarce, soap was rationed, and every drop of washing up water was ideally used twice before being disposed of. But women managed this with practiced efficiency. The difficulty was emotional. To wash a husband's cup, the last one he had used before leaving, felt to many women like an erasure. Several diarists recorded leaving a particular cup unwashed for days, even weeks, not out of neglect but out of a private refusal to complete an action that felt too much like acceptance. The cup appears in no government welfare report, in no psychiatric assessment, in no rationing record. It is found only in private writing, occasionally in letters, and in the memories of elderly women interviewed by oral historians decades later. It is precisely the kind of daily life detail that never made records, and it captures with almost unbearable precision the texture of how ordinary people navigated the emotional terrain of total war. Fact number 57. Playing cards served the wartime military in a function so central to daily life that the Red Cross distributed decks as standard welfare items. Yet the specific games played, the rituals surrounding them, and the unwritten etiquette that governed their use in field conditions were never formally documented. Contract bridge was the most popular game across Allied forces, followed by poker among American men and pontoon among British troops, a distinction observed in survey data collected by the Special Services Division but rarely discussed in any narrative history of the war. What those surveys could not capture was the elaborate microculture that grew around each game, the player who always dealt from the same position, the man who shuffled 3 times, no more, before offering the cut. The unspoken agreement that a hand would be suspended without comment if the player on the left began to look pale and silent, signaling, with no words exchanged, that he needed a moment away from whatever his mind had just shown him. These were the codes of wartime gaming, part recreation, part emotional regulation, part collective agreement to maintain the pretense of normality. They were practiced daily, observed universally, and never once appeared in any official account of how soldiers spent their time. Fact number 58. Women working night shifts in Britain's wartime munitions factories during the peak production years of 1941 to 1944 developed a domestic double life whose contours are only partially visible in the historical record. After 12 hours of precision work, filling shell casings, assembling fuses, checking tolerances on equipment that would eventually kill or be killed, they returned home in the early morning hours to houses where children needed to be woken, breakfasts needed to be prepared, and the day's domestic tasks needed to begin before they could sleep. The Ministry of Labour conducted surveys of factory welfare conditions throughout the war, noting absenteeism rates, accident frequencies, and canteen usage, but the surveys did not extend into workers' homes. What happened in those houses between 6 and 9 in the morning, the management of an exhausted body performing domestic tasks with mechanical competence, the careful maintenance of cheerfulness in front of children who could not be told what their mother had spent the night producing, existed in a gap between two systems of record-keeping, industrial and domestic, that neither system thought to bridge. It was a daily life of extraordinary complexity, performed by hundreds of thousands of women, and it left almost no trace. Fact number 59. The habit of mentally rehearsing an evacuation route was so deeply ingrained in British civilian life during the Blitz years that people continued performing it long after the immediate threat had passed. Wardens reported during post-incident surveys that a significant proportion of civilians who had lived through raids continued, months later, to pause briefly before entering any new room and identify the exits, a habit borrowed, unconsciously, from the ARP training that had been distributed widely since 1937. Children who grew up in bombed cities described doing this automatically into adult life, well into the 1960s and 1970s, without always being able to explain why. The behavior was never formally catalogued as a psychological response to the Blitz, partly because it was functional rather than symptomatic. People who identified exits were, after all, exhibiting precisely the behavior the government had encouraged, and partly because wartime psychological research focused almost exclusively on acute breakdown rather than the chronic, low-level adaptive changes that the war embedded in ordinary daily behavior. The mental route rehearsal was one of those changes, a habit formed in genuine emergency sustained by a body that had learned the lesson too well to unlearn it when the emergency ended. Fact number 60. There was a sound that virtually every civilian in bombed European cities learned to hear with a precision that no musical training or formal education had prepared them for. The particular frequency of the all-clear siren in contrast to the rising undulation of the warning. This distinction is, in retrospect, obvious. The warning wavered, the all-clear held a steady note, but the speed with which urban populations learned to make that discrimination, and the degree to which it became encoded as a physical response rather than a conscious one, was remarkable to medical observers at the time. Dr. John Bowlby, then working at the Tavistock Clinic in London, noted in unpublished clinical notes from 1941 that several of his child patients could not articulate the difference between the two sirens verbally, but responded to recordings of each with entirely different body postures, one relaxing and one tensing, before they were consciously aware of having heard anything. The siren distinction became part of daily life's background architecture, a perceptual routine so automatic it required no effort and generated no memory, which is precisely why it appears in almost no account of what it was like to live through the Blitz. It was too ordinary to notice, too universal to describe. Fact number 61. The specific daily labor of writing letters under wartime censorship, not the fact of censorship, which has been amply documented, but the actual cognitive and emotional work of composing a letter that communicated genuine feeling without triggering a censor's pen, deserves far more attention than it has received. Soldiers writing home from active theaters were technically prohibited from mentioning location, unit movements, casualties, morale, or any information that might assist an enemy who intercepted the letter. In practice, this meant that a man trying to tell his wife that he was frightened or lonely or that the thing he had seen last Tuesday had not yet left his eyes, had to find a way to say so that a sensor scanning for military intelligence would pass without comment. Veterans who discussed their letters in post-war interviews described developing a private vocabulary with their correspondence, allusions to shared memories, references to places or songs that carried emotional freight invisible to a stranger, that amounted to a personal cipher. The daily act of encoding and decoding these letters, performed by both sender and recipient, was a form of creative and emotional intelligence that millions of people exercised routinely and that no official history of wartime communications has ever thought to measure. Fact number 62. Children in wartime Britain developed a relationship with found objects that has never been adequately described, partly because it looked, from the outside, like mere play. In the aftermath of air raids, bomb sites became, by daylight and in the absence of immediate danger, extraordinary playgrounds, fields of broken masonry, shattered furniture, twisted metal, and occasionally intact domestic objects displaced from their context by the violence that had destroyed everything around them. Children collected shrapnel with the enthusiasm of natural historians, cataloguing fragments by size, shape, and source aircraft with a taxonomy they invented themselves. The Wright Museum of WWII has documented several instances of children who kept detailed notebooks of their shrapnel collections, recording weight, date of acquisition, and the raid from which each piece came, an informal archival practice carried out with no adult instruction and no awareness that what they were doing had any relationship to history. These collections were almost universally discarded after the war, thrown away by parents relieved to be rid of the debris of a period they wished to leave behind. The catalogues vanished with them. What remains is the occasional memory and the recognition that children in extremity are capable of an archival instinct that adults in their relief tend to erase. Fact number 63. The daily practice of rationing personal hope, deciding each morning how much optimism was safe to invest in the day, was something that veterans and civilians alike described in post-war testimony as one of the most exhausting invisible labors of the wartime years. Too much hope was dangerous, a letter that did not arrive, a news bulletin that reported gains then losses, a neighbor whose son came home and whose silence about yours told you everything you did not yet officially know. These events could destabilize a person who had invested heavily in a particular outcome. Too little hope was equally destructive, producing a grey flatness that made ordinary tasks feel meaningless and eventually eroded the will to maintain the routines on which household functioning depended. People developed, largely unconsciously, a personal calibration of hope, neither recklessly optimistic nor bleakly resigned, that they readjusted each morning in response to the previous day's evidence. The psychologist William McDougall had theorized something similar in the First World War, and Charles Moran had observed it in frontline soldiers, but the civilian version of this daily emotional calculation was never studied systematically, leaving it as one of the most sophisticated and universal mental habits of the wartime years with almost no formal documentation. Fact number 64. Wartime grocery shopping in Britain was a logistical exercise of surprising sophistication that the housewives who performed it daily had largely mastered by 1942, though its complexity was never formally acknowledged. A typical urban woman managing a household of 4 during the rationing years needed to coordinate the ration books of each family member with the registered shops to which they were allocated, track the week's remaining allowances against the meals she had planned, calculate which items might be available off-ration that day based on informal intelligence from the queue ahead of her, and simultaneously maintain a social relationship with the shopkeeper on whose discretion a small amount of informal generosity occasionally depended. Market researchers employed by the Ministry of Food noted with some awe in internal reports from 1943 that British housewives were performing, without formal training, a form of daily inventory management and supply chain optimization that would have challenged a trained logistics officer. The reports went to internal files and stayed there. The women went home and cooked with what they had bought, and then did the same thing the next morning, and no one thought to describe their daily work as a logistical achievement. Fact number 65. The sound of a wireless set warming up, the soft crackle, the rising hum, the brief moment before the signal resolved into a voice, was one of the most emotionally charged daily sounds of the Second World War, though its significance has been almost entirely overlooked by historians of the period. In Britain, the BBC Home Service broadcast news at fixed, well-known intervals, and households organised their days partly around those intervals in a way that had no peacetime equivalent. The act of switching on the wireless before the 6 o'clock bulletin was not passive. It required a particular kind of preparation, the lowering of conversation, the arrangement of the body into a posture of attentiveness, the brief suspension of whatever domestic task was in progress. Diaries from the Mass Observation Archive record this pre-bulletin pause with remarkable consistency across class, region, and household type, suggesting that the ritual of listening had standardized itself across the country without any official encouragement. What happened in the 30 seconds between switching on and hearing the first words, the small private bracing of the self against whatever was about to be announced, was perhaps the most universal single moment of the British wartime day, and it has never been specifically described. Fact number 66. Among the habits of Pacific Theatre soldiers that appear only in the margins of formal history, one of the most universally observed was the daily practice of writing, or attempting to write, in conditions that made writing almost impossible. Salt spray warped paper. Humidity turned ink to smear. Tropical heat made the act of holding a pen for more than a few minutes physically uncomfortable. And yet the correspondence records of the United States Army during the Pacific Campaign show mail volumes that increased year on year despite all of this, suggesting that soldiers found the means to overcome every physical obstacle the environment placed between them and the act of writing home. What the records do not show is the specific daily ingenuity this required. The tin used as a writing surface, the shirt used as a blotter, the 5 minutes of shade rationed carefully enough to allow a paragraph before the sun moved. These micro-solutions, invented individually and shared informally, constituted a daily practice of communication whose determination was extraordinary. That determination, the refusal to allow a hostile environment to sever the connection between a man and the people who waited for him, is one of the least documented forms of wartime courage in the entire historical literature. Fact number 67. The evening meal in wartime Germany occupied a peculiar position in the daily domestic calendar, shaped by pressures that bore no peacetime equivalent. By 1943, severe food shortages in many urban areas meant that the main meal of the day had migrated to midday, when at least the energy of cooking could be performed in daylight without adding to fuel costs. The evening meal was increasingly a sparse affair. Bread, perhaps a small portion of preserved meat, a bowl of soup stretched from the midday's leftovers, and yet the rituals surrounding it remained, in many households, stubbornly intact. The table was set, conversation was maintained. Children were expected to sit and eat with attention. German historians examining wartime household diaries have noted that the maintenance of these mealtime formalities in the face of increasingly inadequate provisions represented a daily act of social assertion, the claim that domestic normality persisted, that the family was still a family, that whatever was happening in the wider world had not yet reached inside the front door. It was a fiction, and everyone at the table knew it was a fiction, and they maintained it with extraordinary collective discipline every evening for years. Fact number 68. One of the daily wartime habits that has left almost no trace in the historical record is the particular way in which people learned to read other people's faces for news. Before the war, facial expressions in public spaces were, for most urban adults, largely irrelevant. Strangers' emotions were their own business, and the social contract of the city depended partly on the agreement to ignore them. The war dissolved that contract. A woman returning from the post office with an envelope in a particular shade of buff, the War Office used a specific buff for casualty notifications, had a face that her neighbors read involuntarily and with great accuracy. A man emerging from a telephone kiosk who paused for several seconds on the pavement before walking was being observed and interpreted by everyone in the street. People developed a daily fluency in the public display of private grief that had no peacetime equivalent and was never formally discussed, a perceptual skill born of genuine community exposure to loss, practiced every day in queues, on buses, in factories, and along streets that everyone shared and in which everyone's news eventually became communal property. Fact number 69. The children of the wartime generation developed an intimate familiarity with the material texture of scarcity that their peacetime parents had never needed to acquire, and this familiarity expressed itself in daily habits of careful, attentive use that adults noticed without quite understanding what they were seeing. A child who had grown up during rationing did not bite into an apple carelessly. The whole apple was eaten, core included, in a systematic pattern that began at the bottom and worked upward, leaving nothing. A biscuit allocated from a weekly ration was not eaten immediately but carried for some time, handled, sometimes examined before being consumed in a way that extracted every dimension of pleasure from the experience. These habits, scrupulous consumption, the postponement of use, the ritualistic relationship with scarce food, were observed by teachers, pediatricians, and school welfare officers in the immediate post-war years, who initially interpreted them as signs of anxiety before recognizing them as adaptive behaviors formed by genuine material experience. They were daily habits so ingrained that many of the children who practiced them in the 1940s never fully relinquished them, carrying the wartime relationship with scarcity into their adult lives and passing traces of it, bewilderingly, to children who had never known want. Fact number 70. The daily personal hygiene routine of soldiers in the North African theater occupied a disproportionate amount of official military attention for reasons that became urgently clear during the early weeks of the campaign. Desert conditions, extreme heat, near-total water scarcity, ubiquitous fine sand that penetrated clothing, equipment, and human skin with indiscriminate efficiency made every element of standard military hygiene both more important and more difficult. The British Eighth Army's medical records from 1941 to 1943 show disease accounting for more service incapacity than enemy action for significant portions of the campaign, with skin infections, gastrointestinal illness, and eye disease, all hygiene-related, leading the list. What the medical records do not show is how soldiers actually managed their daily hygiene within these constraints, because the daily practice was largely improvised, individual, and unobserved. A man who had learned to shave using a single cup of water, to wash his entire body using a damp cloth no larger than a handkerchief, to clean his teeth with a finger when water was entirely unavailable. This man was exercising a daily ingenuity in the service of his own survival that no officer formally instructed him in and no historian has subsequently thought to document. Fact number 71. The wartime mourning for mothers of young children in Britain was in practical terms an almost entirely undocumented sequence of simultaneous tasks that operated on a logic of priority allocation barely distinguishable from military logistics. In a single morning hour between 6:30 and 7:30, a woman might need to stoke or relight the kitchen range using last night's ash and the week's carefully calibrated coal allocation, prepare a breakfast assembled from rationed items whose portions she had mentally pre-assigned the previous night, get one or more children dressed in clothing that had been mended, altered, and in many cases made from other garments, perform her own necessary ablutions in cold water if hot was unavailable, pack a child's school bag with WWII documentation if the child was newly returned or about to be moved, and leave the house at a specific time to meet a queue that would not wait. The Ministry of Health tracked infant welfare and school attendance. The Ministry of Food tracked ration consumption. No ministry tracked the mourning. It existed in the gap between those systems, performed daily with a competence so complete that it was invisible, the accomplished invisibility of labor so well done that it requires no comment. Fact number 72. There was a daily moment in the lives of soldiers that no military training manual had a word for and no official account of the Second World War has ever tried to describe, yet virtually every veteran who was asked about it, in the oral history projects of the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, remembered it with an immediacy suggesting it had been preserved in some part of memory not subject to the usual softening of time. It was the moment, late in the day, when the light changed. In Northern Europe it happened in the late afternoon, a shift from direct light to a diffused horizontal quality of illumination that turned the landscape briefly beautiful, regardless of what had happened in it during the preceding hours. In the Pacific it came earlier, with a sudden vivid reddening that lasted only minutes. In North Africa it was longer, the desert holding color in ways that the men from England and America had not been prepared for. In that moment, which might last 3 minutes or 10, something in the day's accumulated tension briefly released. Men stopped talking, a letter in progress was laid down, a card game paused. No one gave an order. The pause organized itself from within, and then the light shifted again and the day continued, and no one mentioned it, and no one ever did. Fact number 73. The wartime relationship between people and their shoes has been documented in rationing records and clothing restriction statistics, but never examined as a daily lived experience, which is perhaps why it sounds absurd when framed that way, and yet was anything but. Shoe leather was rationed in Britain from June 1941, with civilians allocated a limited number of coupons per year, insufficient to purchase more than one pair of shoes for most adults. The practical consequence was that people wore the same shoes for years, through seasonal changes that shoes were not designed to accommodate, repairing them repeatedly with resources that were themselves scarce. A man might take the same pair of shoes to a cobbler 6 times in a year, and the cobbler might use cardboard in the sole when leather ran out, and the man would wear those shoes in the rain knowing they would be damaged and wear them anyway because there were no others. This daily negotiation between the body and its inadequate equipment, the specific discomfort of a patched shoe, the particular management of wet feet, the calculation of whether to wear the good pair or the bad pair based on the day's likely challenges, was the sensory texture of millions of lives and has vanished almost entirely from history. Fact number 74. Among the unrecorded daily rituals of the Second World War, one of the most widespread and least examined was the practice of keeping a personal food reserve, not the official stockpile that governments encouraged in the early months of the war, but an individual, private cache maintained by civilians who had, by instinct or calculation, decided that official assurances of supply were insufficiently reliable. A tin of sardines behind the jam, a bag of dried peas in a coat pocket, a small amount of tea saved back from the week's ration and stored in an envelope in a drawer. These reserves were not hoarding in the sense that the government used the term. They did not, in most cases, amount to enough to make any material difference in a genuine crisis, but they were daily maintained, daily assessed, and daily reconsidered. The act of checking the reserve each morning, confirming its existence, adjusting it fractionally when an opportunity arose, was a ritual of private security that no official welfare system could provide, and no historian has recorded. It was the individual's daily answer to the question of what happened if the supply chain finally failed, and it was practiced daily by millions of people who never spoke of it publicly. Fact number 75. The question of what people did with the half hour between finishing the day's final task and going to bed, a period that in peacetime might have been given to reading, or radio, or conversation, was one that the war altered in ways that no leisure survey of the period attempted to measure. Among civilians living near active bombing targets, that half hour was occupied, in whole or in part, by a final audit of preparations, the gas mask by the door, the torch on the shelf, the shelter blanket, the emergency tin. Among households with members serving abroad, it was often the hour of private emotion, the reading of a letter for the 4th or 5th time, the writing of a reply that would be finished tomorrow, the sitting with a photograph in a way that could not be explained to children who asked what mummy was doing. Among soldiers in rear areas, it was the hour of cards, of conversation, of the small creative improvisations, whistling, sketching, carving, that men reached for when the day had left them with enough quiet to hear themselves think. This final unstructured half hour, differently filled by different people in different circumstances, was the day's purest residue, what remained when all the required things had been done, and only the person was left. Fact number 76. Women who served as ARP wardens, ambulance drivers and fire watchers in British cities during the Blitz years occupied an unusual position in the daily social geography of their neighborhoods that has been largely overlooked in historical accounts focusing on their official functions, because their wartime roles required them to be present in the street at hours when no civilian had previously had a reason to be there. Deep in the night, just before dawn, in the empty middle hours of a raid, they accumulated an intimate knowledge of their area that was genuinely unprecedented. They knew which household had a new baby whose crying could be heard through a shelter wall. They knew which elderly man invariably delayed his evacuation to the shelter by exactly the same 6 minutes. They knew the sound of the local streets in rain, in silence, in the aftermath of a bomb. This daily accumulated knowledge was never recorded in any official report, because it was not the kind of knowledge that official reports were designed to capture. It was hyper-local, embodied, and personal, the knowledge of sustained presence rather than formal observation. Several of these women, interviewed in later decades, described it as the most complete knowledge they had ever had of a place, and the most difficult to explain to anyone who had not shared the experience. Fact number 77. The Japanese civilian experience of the Second World War, specifically the daily domestic life of ordinary families in Tokyo, Osaka, and other major cities before the firebombing campaigns intensified in 1945, has been even less documented than its Allied equivalents, partly due to the destruction of records in the bombing itself, and partly due to cultural conventions that placed high value on not drawing attention to private difficulty. What survives in diaries, in oral testimony collected by Japanese academics from the 1970s onward, and in a small number of letters that escaped the bombings, is a picture of daily life organized around scarcity and effort in ways that closely parallel the British home front experience. Women in Japanese cities maintained miso soup from increasingly sparse ingredients, managed fuel rationing under a system whose allocations fell by nearly 60% between 1941 and 1944, and performed daily physical labor, carrying water, hauling firewood, maintaining neighborhood fire prevention structures, that was both physically demanding and collectively organized in ways the Western home front experience rarely required. The daily morning greeting exchanged between neighbors, checking who had heard what, who had received news, who needed something, carried in Japan a weight and complexity that was never publicly acknowledged but was universally understood. Fact number 78. The morning routine of the wartime school teacher in Britain, particularly those working in schools that had received evacuees from different social backgrounds and different parts of the country, represented one of the most complex daily exercises in applied psychology that the war produced, though no one at the time described it in those terms. A classroom in a rural reception area in 1940 might contain children from wealthy London families billeted with working-class village households, children from slum backgrounds billeted with middle-class families who had never encountered extreme urban poverty, and local children whose own lives had been minimally disrupted, but who were sharing their school, their resources, and their teacher's attention with strangers. Every morning the teacher arrived at this situation and managed it, adjusting teaching materials, mediating social tensions, maintaining educational continuity for children whose emotional disruption made learning genuinely difficult, and doing all of this in buildings that were often poorly equipped even before the war, and had not improved since. The teacher's daily improvisation was remarkable, and it was performed by tens of thousands of women. Almost all teachers in those years were women, the men having been called up, and it left no record beyond the occasional school log entry noting an absence or a difficulty, and the adult memories of children who have now themselves almost entirely passed from the world. Fact number 79. The private ritual of looking at a photograph had, by the middle years of the Second World War, become so universal a daily habit for separated families that its emotional structure deserves examination on its own terms. A woman looking at a photograph of her husband was not passively regarding an image. She was engaged in an active process of projection and interpretation, reading the face for signs of the person she knew behind the posed expression of the official photograph, or behind the slightly strained cheerfulness of a snapshot taken at a training camp. She was updating the image against the most recent letter, cross-referencing her internal model of the person with what the photograph offered. She was, in a sense, carrying out a private intelligence assessment of someone she loved, working from fragmentary and potentially misleading data, and doing it daily because the alternative, to stop looking, to allow the image to become merely a record of someone absent, was emotionally unendurable. The act was performed across every country at war, across every class, across every degree of literacy and education, because it required no skills beyond love and attention. It left almost no trace. It was perhaps the most common single daily act of the entire war. Fact number 80. As the war entered its final year, and the prospect of an end shifted from hope to reasonable expectation, a new and largely unexamined daily habit emerged in civilian life across all the Allied nations: the mental rehearsal of the moment of reunion. Women practiced it while peeling potatoes. Children practiced it in school. Soldiers overseas practiced it in the last minutes before sleep. What would be said first, and how, and what expression would be worn, and whether to cry, and whether he would look different, and whether she would, and whether the children would know him, and whether the house would feel right again once he was in it. This rehearsal had no practical purpose. The reunion, when it came, would be entirely unlike anything that had been imagined, but it served a daily psychological function that was in some ways the inverse of the beginning of war habit of preparing for emergency. Where the emergency drills had rehearsed the management of catastrophe, the reunion rehearsal managed the return of hope. It was a private act, intimate beyond any possibility of official observation, and it was performed daily by tens of millions of people across the final months of the war. No one wrote it down. It happened anyway. Fact number 81. Among the small daily acts of defiance practiced by civilians in German-occupied Western Europe, one of the least dramatic and most universally adopted was the maintenance of pre-war cultural forms in private domestic life. A Dutch family that continued to celebrate Sinterklaas in December 1941, against the specific cultural preferences of the occupying authority. A French household that observed the particular forms of Sunday lunch, the specific sequence of courses, the particular wine if any remained, the length of the meal, that German occupation had disrupted but not abolished. A Belgian family that maintained the Tuesday evening of chamber music at home, with 3 players and 1 empty chair for the member who had not come back. These were not acts of resistance in any military or organizational sense. They were daily and weekly assertions that the culture that had formed these families continued to exist inside their doors regardless of what had been done to the world outside them. They left no records, they were never counted. The Gestapo had no category for them. They were in the deepest possible sense the most human acts of the entire occupation. The refusal, daily renewed, to become something other than what one was. Fact number 82. The wartime workplace canteen occupies a curious position in the social history of the Second World War, extensively documented in government welfare reports, widely cited by historians of labor and welfare policy, and yet almost entirely unexamined as a daily experience in its own right. Government nutrition surveys from 1942 and 1943 confirmed that workers eating in subsidized factory canteens were receiving significantly better nutrition than those who brought food from home, and the numbers eating in canteens increased steadily throughout the war as this became more widely understood. What the nutrition surveys did not capture was the daily social function of the canteen that made it, for many workers, the most reliably human part of the working day. The 20 minutes of a canteen lunch were the 20 minutes in which the rules of the factory floor, hierarchy, noise, piecework pace, were temporarily suspended. People chose where to sit. Conversations ranged across topics that had nothing to do with production quotas or shift rotas. News from home was shared. Rumors were assessed. Grief was occasionally briefly acknowledged. It was the daily social commons of the wartime factory, and it was entirely invisible to the welfare reports that logged only the calories consumed within it. Fact number 83. The particular daily challenge of maintaining a sense of personal dignity in conditions that systematically undermined it was one that prisoners of war across every theater navigated with a creativity that their captors rarely understood and their own governments never formally acknowledged. In German POW camps for Allied officers, in Japanese camps for infantry prisoners, in Italian camps for Commonwealth soldiers, men developed daily rituals whose only purpose was to preserve the sense of being a person with an autonomous interior life. The surreptitious maintenance of a personal journal, the improvised theatrical performance rehearsed daily with props assembled from available waste materials that had no audience beyond the participants. The private language of nicknames and shared references that a camp community developed over months into a dense, untranslatable vernacular. These were daily creative acts performed under conditions of extreme deprivation and uncertainty, and they were effective. The extensive post-war psychiatric literature on POW experience consistently identifies the maintenance of individual creative activity as one of the strongest predictors of psychological survival. The daily acts themselves, the journal entry, the rehearsal, the private language, were almost entirely unrecorded, precisely because their effectiveness depended on their invisibility to the authorities who would have suppressed them. Fact number 84. The way in which ordinary people marked the transition between work and home in the wartime years, the specific daily ritual of crossing that threshold, was altered by the war in ways that the psychological literature on the period has only recently begun to examine. Before the war, for many working men in Western cities, the journey home from work was a period of gradual decompression, a zone of transition in which the identity of worker was exchanged for the identity of husband and father. The war complicated this transition dramatically. A man returning from a shift at an armaments factory could not simply leave the factory behind him, because the factory's product was the destruction of human beings, and this knowledge traveled home with him in ways that physical distance could not address. A woman returning from overnight fire watching to a house in which children still needed breakfast made no transition at all. The two roles simply overlapped, each demanding its full share of her capacity simultaneously. The daily management of these impossible transitions, the composing of the self, the putting on of the domestic face, the deliberate decision to be present, was a private psychological labor so universal and so invisible that it has effectively no documentation. Fact number 85. There was a particular quality to the silence of a wartime Sunday in provincial Britain that multiple diarists attempted, and mostly failed, to adequately describe. The absence of traffic, already reduced by petrol rationing, was complete on Sunday mornings in most rural and small-town settings. The church bells had been silenced by government order. They were reserved as an invasion signal, removing from the weekly soundscape a rhythm that had organized Sunday mornings in England for centuries. In their place was a quiet that people described as wrong, as too heavy, as the silence you hear when something is about to happen. Several mass observation diarists noted that they felt more anxious on quiet Sunday mornings than on the weekday evenings of active bombing, because the bombing had at least a sound to attach the fear to. The Sunday silence was formless. The daily habit of filling it, by putting the wireless on early, by finding reasons to speak, by deliberately creating domestic noise, was a coping strategy so universally adopted that no one experienced it as a coping strategy. It was simply what one did on a Sunday morning, made sound against the silence, because the silence left to itself had too much room in it for everything one was trying not to think. Fact number 86. Among the unrecorded daily habits of wartime soldiers, one of the most quietly prevalent was the maintenance of a private object, not a photograph, which was common and well documented, but something smaller and less obviously significant. A stone picked up from a specific path, a coin from the pocket of a man who had not survived, a button from a child's coat, pressed into a letter and kept when the letter was otherwise lost, a seed packet, carried from home, never planted, serving no purpose beyond its existence as a legible fragment of the world that had existed before the war. Veterans who mentioned these objects in later interviews almost invariably did so with a kind of embarrassment, apologizing for sentimentality before describing the object with a precision and warmth entirely disproportionate to its material value. The object's daily function was precisely what made it unrecordable. It was consulted privately, touched briefly at moments when its bearer needed to confirm the continuity between the self who had left home and the self who was here now, and then returned to its pocket or pack. No enumeration of wartime material culture has ever attempted to catalogue these objects, because their significance was entirely personal, and therefore, in any formal sense, invisible. Fact number 87. The daily experience of receiving no news was, for many families of servicemen, more psychologically demanding than the experience of receiving bad news, though it has been studied far less thoroughly. Casualty notification systems in Britain, the United States, and other allied nations were, by the standards of the time, reasonably efficient. Families were formally notified of deaths and severe woundings, usually within weeks and sometimes within days. What those systems could not address was the condition of families whose member was simply absent, posted to a theater from which mail was irregular, or in circumstances where security restrictions precluded communication, or whose letters had been lost in the chaos of a campaign. For those families, the absence of news created a daily void that was neither grief nor hope, but something physiologically distinct from both. Medical surveys of the period recorded elevated rates of insomnia, appetite disturbance, and difficulty concentrating among the wives of men from whom no letters had arrived in more than 4 weeks, symptoms that resolved rapidly, in either direction, when news of any kind finally arrived. The daily experience of that void, the morning envelope check that found nothing, the evening news broadcast scanned for any unit name that might be a clue. was the silent heartbeat of millions of households, and it left almost no record. Fact number 88. As the war drew toward its conclusion and the rhythm of daily life began very slowly to restore something resembling peacetime, a strange new daily habit appeared in British households that several social observers noted with puzzlement at the time and that historians have subsequently ignored almost entirely: the habit of noticing normal things. A woman who had lived for 4 years in wartime London noted in her diary in the spring of 1945 that she had stopped and watched a greengrocer arranging oranges in a window display for several minutes, unable to move on, aware that the display was unremarkable but unable to treat it as such. A man recorded standing on a railway platform and listening to the announcement of an ordinary peacetime train service: a name, a platform number, a time of arrival, and feeling something he could not name move through him at the sound of those entirely ordinary words. These were not dramatic moments. They were the quiet, daily recognitions of a world returning, the noticing of things that had been absent so long that their return was briefly astonishing. They were the reverse of the wartime habit of treating catastrophe as ordinary, and they were, like everything else in this series, entirely unrecorded. Fact number 89. The daily life of the military chaplain in combat theaters, specifically the continuous negotiation between professional obligation, personal faith, and the evidence of what was actually happening around them, has been addressed in several memoirs but almost never examined as a daily routine. Chaplains were required to be present at a remarkable range of daily activities: morning services when circumstances permitted, informal counseling of men who sought them out, the administration of last rites under fire, the notification and documentation of deaths, and the maintenance of a personal spiritual equilibrium that was, by any honest assessment, extremely difficult to sustain when the theological premises it rested on were being tested hourly by material reality. Several chaplains' unpublished diaries, held in denominational archives in Britain and the United States, record a daily practice of private prayer that differed substantially from the formal services they led: rawer, more questioning, less conclusive. The daily private prayer of the wartime chaplain, the man whose professional role required him to offer certainty to others from a position of personal uncertainty, is one of the most human and least examined daily habits of the entire war. Fact number 90. The specific daily domestic labor of keeping a household warm in the final winter of the war in Europe, across Britain, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and the territories where the fighting was heaviest, represents one of the most viscerally difficult material experiences of the entire conflict, and one that has been almost entirely subsumed into the larger narrative of wartime hardship without examination in its own right. In the Netherlands during the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945, fuel was so scarce that families systematically dismantled wooden furniture for burning, beginning with the least necessary items and working inward until only the essential remained. In Germany, urban households burned whatever combustible material the rubble provided. In Britain, coal rationing had reduced the average household's weekly allocation to levels that could heat one room adequately, or several rooms inadequately, and the daily decision of which room to heat, and who would be in it, was made each morning by women managing households in which the margin between survival and crisis was narrow enough to be felt physically. The bodily experience of sustained cold, the daily adjustment of every domestic activity to the requirement of simply maintaining body temperature, is a sensory reality of wartime life that no document adequately captures and no historian has yet found a way to fully convey. Fact number 91. The children born in the first years of the war, those born in 1939, 1940, and 1941, who would have no memory of peacetime because no peacetime existed within their experience, grew up performing daily routines so entirely shaped by wartime conditions that they had no awareness of performing them. The gas mask that hung by the door was simply the thing that hung by the door, as unremarkable as a coat hook. The Anderson shelter at the end of the garden was a place to play on dry days and to sleep on others. The ration book was how food worked. It had never worked differently. These children did not experience wartime as a deviation from normality, because wartime was their normality. The psychological significance of this was noted by pediatricians and child development researchers in the late 1940s when they began to study the adjustment difficulties of children who, unlike these, had a pre-war memory to return to. The children with no pre-war memory adjusted to peace with a puzzling ease that researchers initially attributed to resilience and later recognized as something simpler. They had not lost anything they knew they had. The war was not an interruption, it was the beginning. And the daily routines of the world they entered, the scarcity, the vigilance, the community, the radio news at 6, were the first furniture of their minds. Fact number 92. The wartime relationship between people and their gardens, specifically the transformation of the ornamental garden into the productive allotment, and the daily labor the transformation required, has been extensively documented at the policy level in the Dig for Victory campaign records and Ministry of Agriculture statistics, but almost never examined as a personal daily experience. The daily 20 minutes in the vegetable garden, performed early in the morning before work or in the brief light of a summer evening, was a qualitatively different experience from any other wartime daily task, because the garden operated on a temporality entirely independent of the war's own rhythm. Seeds germinated on their own schedule. Beans did not wait for the news. The daily labor of tending a growing thing, watering, weeding, tying up, watching for pest damage, was a daily encounter with a form of life that was proceeding normally, regardless of everything else, and this normalcy was, for many people, a profound daily consolation. Several mass observation diarists described the garden as the only place where the war did not feel present, not because it was possible to forget the war there, but because the garden's own requirements demanded a quality of attention that left no room for the war's particular textures of anxiety and suspension. Fact number 93. Among the daily habits of wartime civilians that have been almost entirely erased from the historical record is the practice of what might be called informal news brokerage, the daily exchange of information between neighbors, shopkeepers and community members that supplemented, corrected, and occasionally contradicted the official broadcasts and newspapers. This was not rumor in the pejorative sense that government information officers used the term. It was something more specific. A daily, systematic aggregation of local intelligence, who had received a telegram, which factory had been hit, whether the delivery had come, what the warden had said, what the doctor had told Mrs. Whoever, that provided communities with a layer of situational awareness that no official channel offered, and that was in many cases more accurate in its local detail than anything the BBC broadcast. The men and women who served as nodes in these informal networks, the postmistress, the corner shop owner, the school secretary, the district nurse, performed a daily information function of genuine social importance entirely without official recognition, entirely without record, and entirely without compensation beyond the implicit social prestige of being the person who always knew. Fact number 94. The physical act of making a bed in wartime conditions was for a surprisingly large number of people a daily exercise in negotiated compromise between the requirements of military or civil defense routine and the simple material fact of inadequate bedding. Soldiers in field conditions made do with whatever the quartermaster had provided, supplemented by whatever could be improvised, and the military imperative of a made bed, the tight hospital corners, the smooth upper surface, was maintained even in conditions where the mattress was a ground sheet and the pillow was a pack. Civilians whose Anderson shelters had become de facto bedrooms during the Blitz period managed the intersection of damp, cold, and inadequate insulation with a daily ingenuity that no one officially supervised. Old coats repurposed as blankets, newspaper as insulation, the physical arrangement of bodies in a shelter designed for 6 but occupied by 8. The made bed, neat, functional, maintained, was in both contexts a daily assertion of order in a situation designed by external forces to be disorderly. It was entirely ordinary, it was entirely universal. It was performed every single morning by millions of people, and it has left almost no trace beyond the occasional photograph and the occasional diary note that begins, "Managed to sleep, if it can be called that." Fact number 95. The experience of the wartime teenager, specifically those aged 14 to 17, too young to serve, old enough to understand, occupying a peculiar liminal position in every social structure the war created, has been examined largely through the lens of their eventual contribution as young adult soldiers, nurses, or workers, and almost never in terms of their daily civilian life as adolescents. Yet the wartime teenagers' daily experience was distinctive in ways that had lasting developmental consequences. They were old enough to be genuinely useful domestically and were, in many households, functioning as the primary supporting adult in the absence of fathers and the employment of mothers. They were young enough to retain a teenager's legitimate desire for peer company, amusement, and the testing of identity, desires that the war complicated without abolishing. The daily negotiation of those competing demands, the domestic responsibility of a young adult, and the social needs of an adolescent, was performed by millions of teenagers across the Allied and Axis nations in conditions that their parents had not experienced and that no official welfare system had designed itself to support. It was the daily coming of age of a whole generation, conducted entirely in the margins of a history focused on older people and their more legible contributions. Fact number 96. The particular daily quality of attention that wartime demanded, the sustained background vigilance that could be relaxed slightly in a period of relative safety, but could never be entirely relinquished, because the relative safety was understood to be temporary, was described by multiple diaries and medical testimonies during the war as a tiredness of a kind they did not have a word for. It was not sleepiness, which suggested a deficit of rest that could be addressed by sleep. It was not depression, which suggested a loss of emotional resources that clinical intervention might address. It was rather the exhaustion of sustained readiness, the physiological cost of maintaining a nervous system in a state of low-level alert for months and years at a time. Contemporary military medicine had a developing vocabulary for acute stress responses but almost none for chronic low-level vigilance fatigue, and so the condition went unnamed and largely untracked. Post-war epidemiological studies, comparing health outcomes between civilians who had lived in heavily bombed areas and those who had not, found statistically significant differences in cardiovascular disease, autoimmune conditions, and certain psychiatric diagnoses consistent with sustained stress exposure. But by that point, the daily experience that had produced those outcomes had been filed under the generic heading of wartime hardship, and its specific daily texture had long since been quietly forgotten. Fact number 97. The end of the war in Europe, arriving in May 1945, created a daily life disruption almost as significant as the one with which the war had begun, though the literature on it is much thinner. VE Day itself, its immediate celebrations, its crowds, its lights, has been extensively documented. What has not been documented is the day after VE Day, and the day after that, and the weeks that followed, during which millions of people who had organized their daily lives around the requirements and rhythms of total war found themselves in the bewildering position of no longer needing those routines. The blackout was lifted, but many families continued to check the curtains before turning on the lights, because the habit was deeper than the regulation. The daily queue at the ration shop continued because rationing itself continued for years after the war. Food rationing in Britain did not end until 1954. But the psychological register in which the queue was performed had changed, subtly but perceptibly, in a way that no official record noted. The wartime daily routine did not end on a specific date. It faded, gradually and unevenly, as the conditions that had created it slowly and incompletely dissolved, leaving in many people a daily life residue, an attentiveness, a frugality, a preparedness that the post-war world neither required nor entirely erased. Fact number 98. The postal system of the wartime years deserves a specific acknowledgement as the infrastructure on which the daily emotional life of separated families depended in ways that no other wartime system, rationing, civil defense, welfare, could approach. The British General Post Office handled over 1,600,000,000 letters and parcels to and from armed forces personnel in 1943 alone, a volume that required not only extraordinary logistical expansion but a daily workforce of sorters, carriers, and local delivery personnel whose labor kept the system functioning. The letter that arrived, or did not arrive, at a specific household on a specific morning was the product of that enormous system, and it arrived into a domestic space whose daily atmosphere it could transform completely. The posture of the body during letter reading, the rereading, the folding and placement, the decision of whether to share specific paragraphs with children or to hold them back until later. The composition of the reply begun that same evening. This daily emotional circuit, sending, waiting, receiving, responding, was the most important non-military communication system of the entire war. It was performed by tens of millions of people, and it has never been examined as a daily routine in its own right. Fact number 99. The generation that had survived the Second World War emerged from it carrying, in ways they could not always articulate, a transformed relationship with ordinary daily experience. The mundane, a warm meal, a lit room, a bed that could be slept in without preparation, a morning that began with no particular threat, had been rendered precious by its absence, and many veterans and civilians carried that preciousness into their peacetime lives as a daily undercurrent. The sociologist and veteran writer Paul Fussell wrote of returning servicemen that they possessed a doubled vision of ordinary life, seeing it simultaneously as it appeared and as it had appeared when it was gone, that made certain routine pleasures almost unbearably vivid. The morning cup of tea, the sound of rain on a roof that would not be bombed, the face of a child in a kitchen that was warm. These daily experiences, which had been unremarkable before the war, carried for years afterward a quality of almost painful gratitude that was rarely spoken and never officially recorded, because gratitude for ordinaries is not the kind of feeling that makes it into the historical record. It simply colors the daily life of those who feel it, invisibly and completely, until they are gone. Fact number 100. There was a final daily routine of the wartime years that belongs in this series precisely because it occupied no official category and served no function that a welfare system or military organization could have identified. It was the practice, observed across every country, every class, every degree of literacy, of simply sitting still for a few minutes with no particular purpose, usually toward the end of the day, after the children were in bed or the fire was tended or the final letter was written. In that sitting, nothing happened that could be described as an event. A woman looked at the fire. A soldier looked at the space of sky visible through a tent opening. A factory worker sat on the edge of a bunk and did not think about anything in particular, or thought about everything in no particular order. No one recorded these minutes because there was nothing in them to record, and yet the testimony of almost everyone who lived through the wartime years, if asked with sufficient patience and openness, includes some version of this sitting, this daily moment of unclaimed time, neither productive nor restorative in any way the war understood, that persisted through the entire length of the conflict, surviving bombing and rationing and loss and exhaustion, maintained not by any regulation or requirement but simply by the fact of being human in an inhuman time. Fact number 101. On the morning of the 8th of May, 1945, across the cities and villages and farms of Britain and the liberated countries of Western Europe, people woke up and performed their morning routines. They rose, they dressed, they put the kettle on, they went to check whether the post had come. The routines were, from the outside, identical to those of the previous morning, and the one before that, and the hundreds of mornings before that. And yet every person who performed them that morning knew, in a way that ordinary language resists, that something had changed, not in the routine itself, but in its meaning, in the substrate of feeling on which the routine now rested. The fire was still lit the same way. The tea was still measured from the same tin. The bread was still rationed, and the shoes were still patched, and the gas mask was still by the door, but the morning was different. The diarists who wrote about that morning, the mass observation records are full of them, reached almost uniformly for the same inadequate word, ordinary. It felt ordinary, they wrote, meaning not that it was unremarkable but that it had been restored to the condition of the merely mundane, which for years had seemed so impossibly remote as to be almost mythological. The most important daily routine that never made the records was this one, the first ordinary morning after all the others, the morning when waking up had no war in it, the morning when everything that had been suspended was, slowly, astonishingly, simply allowed to resume. The 101 facts gathered in this series were never supposed to exist, at least not in any form that official history was designed to preserve. They live, insofar as they live at all, in the margins of diaries kept in pencil on rationed paper, in the half-sentences of oral testimonies recorded by patient interviewers decades after the events they describe, in the statistical residue of welfare surveys that asked the wrong questions but occasionally, in their raw data, implied the right ones. They are the habits and rituals and daily micro-decisions of a generation that spent 6 years performing the greatest improvised adaptation in modern history, with almost no acknowledgement that an adaptation was taking place. The argument for attending to them is not sentimental. It is analytical. History written exclusively from official records, from military dispatches, government circulars, casualty statistics, production figures, produces a version of the past populated by systems and outcomes, from which the actual experience of being alive during those events has been almost entirely removed. What remains is accurate as far as it goes. It simply does not go far enough into the texture of what it meant to be a person in that time, managing a household under rationing, or cleaning a mess tin for the 14th consecutive evening, or sitting still for 8 unwitnessed minutes before bed, in a world that had been threatening for years to become something other than survivable. What this series has tried to trace is the specific embodied intelligence required to keep going under the conditions of total war, the calibration of hope, the encoding of love into censored letters, the navigation of a blacked-out street by memory and touch, the polishing of a belt buckle toward the vanishing point of a day's accumulated tension, the management of a child's breakfast with hands that had spent the night assembling shell casings. These were not simple acts. They required judgment, endurance, creativity, and a sustained willingness to invest effort in a future whose existence could not be guaranteed. They were performed by people of every social class, nationality, and degree of formal education, which suggests that the capacity they drew on was not a product of training or privilege, but something more widely distributed. What might, without sentimentality, be called the basic human insistence on continuing. The wartime daily routine also reminds us, with some force, that the most important consequences of historical events are often the ones that cannot be measured. The post-war welfare state in Britain was partly built on the moral capital of shared civilian suffering during the war, but the specific daily experiences that generated that sense of solidarity, and whose accumulation over 6 years created the political conditions for it, are exactly the experiences this series has tried to recover. The victory garden and the rationed meal and the evening wireless ritual were not merely inconveniences managed by a resilient population. They were the daily constitution of a community that discovered, by being forced to share discomfort, that it was capable of solidarity on a scale it had not previously attempted. There is also a lesson here about what is preserved and what is lost. Official archives keep what official systems produce: the orders, the statistics, the policy decisions, the outcome assessments. They do not keep the quality of silence on a wartime Sunday morning. They do not keep the way a woman's face changed when she heard the postman's footsteps approaching or retreating. They do not keep the specific weight of a child's hand in a dark shelter while waiting for the all clear. These experiences are not recoverable in full, and no amount of archival industry will recover them. What can be done? What this series has attempted is to name them carefully enough that their absence from the record becomes legible, so that anyone reading this understands not only what happened during the Second World War, but what kind of thing we have lost the ability to fully know.